Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see all of your faces. I'm really excited for this conversation, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background context. Part of the reason why we felt like it was important to have this conversation is um, because of an article that I wrote. And I know that the panelists have spoken about this in different contexts, but I just wanted to share a little bit around what went into the thought behind that article. So I wrote an article a few months ago, and the title of the article was, Is it possible to change an oppressive workforce from the inside? And I've been thinking a lot about this as an external consultant, the power that I have to change a environment or a company, and also the power that people who work internally have. And it seems like just in speaking with the friends that I have that do this work internally, that work as like chief diversity officers or diversity managers, it seems like there is often an impasse that they reach where it's really, really difficult to change the structure, especially if you're part of that structure or environment. So I really wanted us to explore that in a little bit more detail, because some of you may be in positions right now where you're trying to change the power structures or redistribute power within your organization, and you're trying to figure out how to do that. And I guess I wrote the article and I was sort of pessimistic. I'm also biased because I'm an external consultant, and I do feel like while it's not impossible to change the structures in which you work, I think it's really, 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 really challenging when you're trying to change the same people that are signing your paychecks. So I do think that that is an important thing that we have to sort of think about and talk about. And that's kind of part of the catalyst behind this conversation. But Farzin, you're one of my favorite, if not my favorite voice on LinkedIn, because you always sort of speak on some of these structural and systemic issues in a very sort of real and honest way. So I would love to hear your thoughts on like whether you actually think it's possible to change the structure that a person is part of, especially if you're a junior employee that maybe doesn't have a lot of power. How do you go about, or do you even think it's possible to go about to changing that structure?
I think your article, is it possible to change an oppressive workplace from the inside, like resonated with so many of us, because we've realized how much energy it takes to, on a personal level and even on a collective level, to kind of change these not just like, I'm not talking about even on a systemic level, just to make minor incremental changes in the workplace. I want to kind of take a step back and kind of go over a little bit of my kind of understanding of how we got here and why that's so difficult, before I kind of even go into, is it even possible? So the way I typically frame these things is that if we look at capitalism in its current form as an outgrowth of the systems of colonial oppression that have existed in its prior, that capitalism just kind of changed some of the players, as opposed to it being a state run enterprise where we're going to different territories across the planet and exploiting land, labor, and resources. The capitalists emerged out of the Industrial Revolution, which were kind of separate from the state kind of apparatuses. So like, because of that, there wasn't as much sort of structural like violence that was implemented as you'd see with colonialism, which is a literal movement to a place and taking of. It morphed a little bit. The violence just subsided just slightly, although you can make lots of arguments about capitalism is basically neocolonialism, all these things. But what happened was, in our current structures that live in this capitalist society, basically adopted the same structures of colonialism. You have very hierarchical systems where there are power brokers at the top. And if those power brokers emerged from Europe, they're obviously going to implant European values into the system. So you are constantly, if you're trying to make any sort of change, you're constantly swimming against this current, right? It takes a lot of sustained energy to make change, right? Unless you deconstruct the system and replace it with something that's much more egalitarian. I'll give you an example of how much energy it takes. Like I believe it was in I think 2018 when workers at Google, and not unionized, these were just like an organized protest. About 20,000 across the globe, Google employees walked out, and that was because of sexual harassment in the workplace. The thing that they got was an apology and a commitment to stop forced arbitration, right? Something that should be normal. That was that incremental change. It took 20,000 employees to do that. And even then, you're still at the mercy of the power brokers of that system. So those employees, the 7 or so employees that organized the whole thing, were complained later about retaliation, right? So this wasn't necessarily, so it takes that kind of energy. But if we're trying to operate in this system, we have to think of ways of actually making that change. So we can do a mass protest, we can do a letter writing campaign where everybody signs. The best way in this current system, I believe, to check that those power brokers and force their hand is through unionization, unions. But we all know that union power in this country is very low. So we think of other mechanisms. ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, are more structured ways of making incremental change. Although they're still at the mercy of the system, they can be disbanded. So it is possible on an incremental level, but we still are at the mercy of the system. And usually the system or the house, the organization, tends to win out.
Yeah, I think what I think about a lot is accountability and how to hold leaders accountable, because I think accountability is a huge piece of the equation when we think about redistributing collective power. If leaders are being held accountable for the way that they treat people in the environments that they are creating, then they're going to be more mindful of those environments, and they're not going to treat people, they're not going to mistreat people. And Farzin, you brought up the Google walkout or the protests. I also remember, I think around that time, there was something very similar that happened with McDonald's, where they had different employees from different locations who were protesting the sexual misconduct that the employees had experienced, with little to no repercussions for the people who had caused the harm. And I don't even really know what ended up happening in that case, probably something similar. So I think it's a really difficult question when we think about how do we hold leaders accountable, because leaders aren't incentivized to hold themselves accountable. There are often measures to assess equity and inclusion in an environmental level, but there aren't any sort of like sanctions if companies aren't following those, those rules or those objectives that they set out to follow. And I think one of the problems that I run into as an external consultant is even within the employee resource groups and affinity groups, sometimes employees tell me that they feel like the group is just in place as sort of like as a nice to have, like they're not actually able to create change. So if the resource groups are mostly in many organizations, junior level employees, what power do they have, if any at all, to actually create change? And I think one of the things you talked about, Farzin, that's important is collective power. And though we might not have a lot of like status power or whatever it is in our companies, it's really important that we're coming together. And I think that there's a lot of power if 20 of your employees are saying that they want something or that they need something, or they're posting about it on social media. I think that is one of the tools that we have to actually create change, is that companies are afraid of litigation and they're afraid of being blasted on social media. But even with that, I think companies rely on the world's forgetfulness. I think after a week or two, we get mad at a company, we might drag them on social media, and then people forget, and then they can kind of fall back into their old ways. And I think Starbucks is a great example. If you all remember in 2018, with the situation that happened where a manager in a Philadelphia Starbucks called the police on two Black men because they weren't buying any items. People protested Starbucks, people boycotted Starbucks. The then CEO apologized and he issued a public apology. And they did that 1 day anti-bias training or unconscious bias training. And 3 or 4 years later, I don't really know what else systemically has changed in those situations. So that's where I kind of struggle with, like, whether, and I say this to my friends who work internally, I think one of the things that is important to think about is when you're doing this work and you're working internally, how exhausting it can be. You're like fighting against a system or swimming against a system that, like you said, Farzin, that is not changing, or that seems like it's not changing. And it almost feels like, why am I here? Or why am I doing this work if I am constantly trying to like serve as a sort of like a protective barrier against the harm that employees are experiencing. And many times the folks that are doing this work belong to marginalized or have marginalized identities themselves. So you're navigating that and also navigating trying to change the system. And I just don't think one person ever has the power to do that. And maybe, again, I'm being kind of cynical or I'm being pessimistic, but I do think before going into this work, there has to be an understanding of how challenging it can be and how almost impossible it is when you're working by yourself to try to change the system. So I think part of the way that we get that accountability is by coming together as a collective.
Thanks, Janice. I want to highlight a couple of things that you said. Like, I fully agree with you on the limits of external accountability. I mean, I think putting things out there in social media, I mean, we've come to have such a fast-paced, like, we call it outrage culture, but it's really just kind of in the moment, right? Like, it does make some change, at least visibly in the moment. But again, like I mean, that's fleeting. It always reverts back to the system that we've designed for it. So if we place the power in the hands of a few individuals who have ultimate decision-making capacity, we're also putting power into the hands of things they don't like, their biases, you know, all these things that can influence. And eventually those things are going to come out. Like, you know, was it, I can't remember the philosopher that basically said, I'm the state, right? Like, referring to his authoritarian rule, like he is the arbiter of everything that happens in the state. And our organizations run very similarly, although nuanced, you know, it's a little bit distributed. But so I think like the skepticism of making change is very well received, and it's something I struggle with when I'm doing my trainings. Is like, how do we hold our organizations accountable? One thing that we definitely have to take into consideration is, going back to the Google example, is that it takes a lot of risk and responsibility to kind of, if you're a leader working up against the system, right? If you're leading the charge of resistance, there's a target on your back, right? You are the individual that's going to take the most brunt of it. So distributing that risk and responsibility, and making sure that as we exercise collective power, we see it through to the end. It's not just we've made our we've had our demands met on the outset. Accountability is making it sustainable, and also making sure that nobody who's involved is retaliated against, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot working against us, and even the greatest tool that we Tissa, thank you. It was Louis. It was the 14th, yeah, the Sun King, right? Or was it Napoleon? I'm sorry. It was French guy said it. Je suis l'état, I think it was. But anyhow, so I think it's very, very important to kind of recognize the risk in exercising collective power, of the power of our networks. And so yeah, we have a lot to kind of think through.
Yeah, one question that I think is, and maybe I know we'll unpack it later as well, but one question that I think is important for us to talk about is, how can employees organize collectively? Because I think the power is within the collective, And I think that it's important to also note that when we think about white supremacy as a system, one of the things that it does is it makes us feel separate and individual, and it takes us away from the community oriented mindset. And I think that one of the fears with unionization within companies, leaders don't want us to come together, and leaders don't want people to unionize and to join, because there is an understanding that within the collective, there is a lot of power. So what do you think as far as ways that employees can organize collectively to bring about change that is sustainable?
I think, I think honestly, like if you're able to, like collective bargaining, collective organization, either structured through union or walkouts, those do have the most effect, I believe. And unionization is a like a structural kind of and an organizational, basically systematized check on that power. It's not in the moment. It's not ad hoc. It's there's a legacy of it. It's sustainable. So, but again, like it's so difficult because so many states in this country have created these right to work laws where it makes it almost nearly impossible to form and sustain a union, collect union fees and all these things. So if we can try and figure out ways of replicating union action, labor on labor rights, that is the best thing we can do in the moment. I did mention employee resource groups. I did mention walkouts, letter writing campaigns, external accountability. These things kind of, again, they're high energy, but low impact, and require sustained energy over time, sustained high energy over time. And so these are some ways of checking and making sure that things incrementally change. Hopefully, the idea is to change the mindset of the power brokers in your organization to be much more progressive and egalitarian, thinking about how people operate in the workplace and the things that, the coercion in the workplace, and being more flexible and all these things. And a collective show of force kind of does that to a certain degree, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. People revert back to old behaviors. It's not always sustainable. So I think I share, like, again, I think I share your pessimism and sometimes cynicism here, Janice, on how exactly we can maintain this stuff, but it requires a lot of sustained energy. I know a lot of ERGs that I've worked with, very excited in the outset, do a lot of great programming, mostly celebratory. I mean, that's fine in the moment, but momentum loses out, right? People get diversity fatigued. They question why they don't do this. They're not compensated adequately. So compensation for ERGs is important. The people putting the labor into the ERGs is important. And so that's an alternate, like, structural check to unions, but I would never say ERGs take the place of unions. I will say that sometimes, for example, I've seen a lot of success from the employee resource or affinity groups that focus on individuals' disabilities, kind of reframing, how we talk about disabilities, or even lobbying to get, certain accessibility items on the plate and that kind of thing. And again, it takes the reception of the power brokers in an institution to make that, to foster that change, to drive that change. But sort of that's this collective show of force that we're talking about. All of it is, again, it's fleeting, right? It can collapse at any moment. There's no, like, in the absence of a union, there's nothing structurally holding it in place. There's so yeah, there's certain things that we can do to express power. Most of it is in the moment, just like the Google walkout, just like the Starbucks thing. But without a true deconstruction of the power structure of an organization and a reimagining of it, it's a lot of energy, I would say.
Yeah, I think sometimes we just have to be honest with the structures in which we work, and just do, like, a lot of us are just doing what we have to do to survive the structures that we're in. And it is unfortunate that a lot of these larger companies, especially those that have been around for a while, I never say anything is impossible, but it's almost impossible to change the power dynamics because there is no incentive to hold leaders accountable. Why would I want to, if I'm a leader, why would I want to hold myself accountable? Like, there's no incentive or push to do that. So I can I can hire people from different backgrounds and with different abilities. Does that mean I'm treating them fairly or treating them equitably? Who's holding me accountable for actually doing that? So I think that for a lot of folks, the sad reality is that change will not come until we leave those environments and those structures. And I think there is privilege in being able to leave a toxic environment. And many people cannot do that. So I think that the internal person or even the external person that comes in to help the organization should serve as like a barrier at the very least, so that the sort of like harmful behavior that you were experiencing, there's sort of like a shield. You may still experience it, but that person who is hired on behalf of the organization is working on behalf of the employees to help them. And that could be, some companies have an ombudsman where it's like an external entity that is helping to resolve issues, and employees need to know that those resources are available. I was speaking with somebody who works in a university, and she was saying she didn't even know her university had an ombudsman. She didn't even know that there was this external person outside of HR, outside of leadership, that she could speak to. So there are resources that are available to employees. Employees just don't always know that those resources are available. And I know I saw Constance in the chat had said, it starts with fostering trust with those employees. And I think that in a lot of organizations, the trust has been broken, and it's going to take a lot to rebuild that trust, but it starts with accountability, and leaders have to be accountable and holding themselves accountable. But I struggle because I feel like there isn't an incentive for leaders to hold themselves accountable. So how do you make people like be introspective and think about the ways that they're creating the environments that they're creating? So that's what I struggle with. But I think that one thing that when you think about collective power, one thing that we have to understand is that sometimes changing the environment is going to take, unfortunately, sacrifices. And you might have to be that person to speak up and to stick your neck out. And there are consequences that might come with that. But I try to think about it as far as I'm making the environment better for the people that come after me. So if I have to be the sacrificial lamb of my organization for change to actually happen, then for me, I'm kind of like, so be it. And it's unfortunate. I know that some people just want to go to work and clock in, clock out, and be done with it and not be like the martyrs of their organization. And it's, but I think that that's important to also think about. And how do we get back to that community mindset? Because I do think in the workplace, a lot of us are sort of like, how can I move and advance and ascend within this company without thinking about the collective? So I think that it's important for us to get back to that, because that's where the true power lies, is in that collective.